very much for listening. Now, we're going to talk about floating offshore wind energy and the question, who is ahead in the game? And to talk about that, I'd like to ask Christopher Rowland and Matthieu Pettinitty to join me on stage. Bonjour. Yeah, how are you? Hello. Nice to see you too. OK. Excusez-moi, est-ce que vous pourriez... vous pourriez déplacer cette conversation? C'est gentil. Au revoir, merci. Welcome. Now, this is what we call the battle. The UK against France. We have two competitors, and you're going to decide who's going to win, right? I'll let you introduce yourself for a change. Who are you?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. It's a pleasure this morning. My name is Chris Rowland. I am a commercial manager with Flotation Energy. We are a Scottish floating offshore wind developer based in the UK, in Scotland. My experience is in offshore wind for about 10 years, previously with RWE and Ørsted, and prior to that in the oil and gas industry. Yeah, nice to be here today.
All right. What about you?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So Matthieu Pettinitti, business developer at Oxan Energy since 2 years. So it's a new adventure through this new entity. So Oxan Energy is an offshore wind developer with our core market in France. So that's why we are defending France today. But as well, we have some projects in Italy, Estonia, and I'd say investigating other markets as well. So nice to meet you all.
OK. Team UK, Team France, right? Team UK. Give us a quick overview of how the floating market on the other side of the English Channel works.
OK, so first of all, I think what's important is in the UK, we have a two-stage system. So we have, first of all, the seabed leasing round, and then perhaps 4 to 5 years later, the CFD auction. And the CFD regulatory framework has been quite well established in the UK. We're now into the allocation round 7, but prior to that, we've had the renewable obligation scheme with government support since 2002, so over 20 years of government support into renewables. So with that regulatory framework, there's a good amount of, let's say, certainty and stability for the renewables industry. And over that time, we've seen significant developments in fixed bottom offshore wind with, progressive LCOE reduction over time through the 2000s and 2010s. I think that environment, and then together with perhaps the experience in the North Sea with the offshore oil and gas industry, has led to a sort of good nurturing ground for floating offshore wind, with a lot of experience and expertise coming both from the fixed bottom offshore wind industry and or the oil and gas industry, and of course with SPSOs and other technologies with mooring systems, etc. There's a lot of transferable skills. So I think those combinations brings together a good environment for floating offshore wind to develop. And then what we've seen in recent years is good government support in terms of a regulatory framework through the CFD allocation framework to nurture, let's say, test and demonstration scale floating offshore wind, smaller projects and pilot projects, but also now with Greenvolt floating wind farm at 560 megawatts, we see a platform for sort of commercial scale floating offshore wind to develop. And I think that's given a great environment to trigger supply chain engagement and traction, let's say, for building out a credible industry and to solve some of the engineering problems that needs to be tackled.
Thank you.
Nice
How
one.
about France?
How about France? So it's a different model. Basically, it's a centralized approach. So meaning that the French state basically manage first definition of the area in the different seafronts in France, and then we're following with a local consultation with fishermen, with region, etc., to ensure that there will be acceptable areas for everyone to develop at proper and qualitative projects. And as well, after they perform the survey, so the site surveys on metocean, wind, environmental, soil, etc. So all the information that developers need to prepare a bid submission, basically. And the last point, obviously, with the French government is that they are, I'd say, ensuring that on the French TSO, the offshore grid substation will be handled by RTE, so our French TSO. So it gives as well a bit more, I'd say, less risk for developers to bid in.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and I think this is a really key point in terms of difference between the two markets, where the UK, the developers are in early in the sense that they have to do the site selection work, the environmental studies themselves at that seabed leasing stage, and that requires a certain amount of financial commitment as well as investment in the site and the team. So by CFD stage, you can say they've already invested quite a lot into that specific site area. That can give developers, let's say, more commitment to a site, but also more confidence in it at the time of CFD, which I think allows later the execution timeline to be slightly optimized, and also for the CFD delivery, we have quite stringent requirements to deliver against the LCCC contract for the government. I think on the other side, we have the transmission aspect, which perhaps we'll come on to, where in the UK we have to deliver the OFTO, so the offshore transmission assets as on the developer side, and that of course requires the developers to both manage those assets, which puts the risk on the developer side to ensure they're in place in time. But I think increasingly we also see that holistic planning of transmission assets, particularly with larger offshore wind farms. We see HVDC systems, etc., for commercial scale and industrial scale floating offshore wind needing to be further offshore and require that more holistic network planning.
What do you respond to that?
In terms of, and I totally agree with you, and that's the I'd say advantage for France, not only on the offshore, I'd say, grid solutions, but like for the offshore wind solution is quite specific, especially when you go to floating, etc. So in France, we still have the LTE who is doing a great job on this, and he's the single entity that, I'd say, managing coordination and overall I'd say the nation. So it helps as well to make sure that we have a single point of contact that has experience in doing so. So developing some offshore wind substation to, for us, just connect basically our offshore wind farms to those substations. So it helps a lot, to be honest. And as I said earlier as well, for the site surveys, the government give all the site surveys for free, for all the pre-qualified applicants so far. So as well, it's a bit better for us, obviously, because we don't have to put those money at risk to win the projects. And that's one of the big advantages of France. Obviously, there's many as well. We can talk about maybe the CFD mechanism as well. That's a key one, because, as I say, in France, we have the sites and we have as well CFD in the same time. So it's a full package, basically, that when we are awarded for a site, that gives, I'd say, all the ingredients, basically, to move forward and to develop, I'd say, a proper projects.
Yeah, and I think when we look at the CFD framework, of course, in the UK, we're very proud of our CFD framework, and over the years it's evolved as a, let's say, stable but supportive mechanism. But as we see in the industry, not least in UK with allocation round 5, Denmark, Norway, and other markets, no sort of allocation round framework is fully resilient or robust to the supply chain pressures and the current sort of economic situation. So, I think all frameworks need to evolve, and UK has with the 15-year framework a good platform, but I think other markets, increasingly looking to longer CFD terms now, reflects, let's say, the supply chain constraints, the greater certainty that investors need for long-term projects. We see for floating offshore wind commercial floating projects a lead-in time of perhaps 14 years from inception through to operations, and this is a very long time to build a significant infrastructure asset. And increasingly, as we go from, let's say, pilot studies to commercial scale to industrial scale, and we're talking about sort of 1.4 gigawatt projects. Our next project, 1.4 gigawatts, requires that HVDC system investment. It becomes very much critical infrastructure and needs that government support and the CFD framework to match, let's say, the supply chain requirements.
And to respond to that, I agree. In France, we have indexation of CFD, so it's two-sided CFDs. So it helps to get, let's say, a more secure fundings of the projects from the developers. And it's indexed, so meaning that there's a part of the inflation that is covered in this CFD during the development phase, but as well operation phase. That's a bit the mechanism that the French state is implementing as well in the tenders. So that helps for developers as well a lot to secure for the long term is 20 years CFD, some revenues as well. So even from the investor, the banks, etc., it gives more confidence in the fact that we'll produce electricity, we'll have let's say a tariff fixed for the next years to make sure that we can have a profitable, let's say, projects and qualitative projects.
Yeah, no, I do agree with the indexation flexibilities, and I think that has reflected, let's say, some of those supply chain constraints. I think going back to the transmission side and the OFTO concept, this has both advantages and disadvantages. But with that on the developer side, there is the incentive to get to first power as soon as possible, and then developers are incentivized, with the CFD contract to meet those sort of stringent timelines. And I do think that does help the deliverability of projects, and it can be very challenging for developers. And I think in particular in floating offshore wind, where the market is immature, and the supply chain requires a lot of investment, and there's a lot of learning to do to realize these construction contracts. There will be more flexibility needed in floating offshore wind compared to fixed offshore wind.
Do you think there's an argument to be made? You said that the government in France is providing all the data. Christopher, is that maybe also a bad thing because it might not be adapted to what the developers need?
Yeah, I think in the early stage, the site suitability stage, there has become over time more industry best practice, you can say, and a standardized approach to this phase of the projects. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as a negative. We also see in the UK, the Crown Estate Scotland and others looking to share data and provide more information at the lease stage. So I do think there's a sort of natural direction of travel, and there is synergies in the DevEx to be made because of that. But what I would say is that developers in the UK, they do have some degree of commitment and some degree of financial cost in that very early stage, which, of course, means that they have a clear intent to bring these projects through to CFD and delivery later.
And just to comment on the supply chain, I think in France we are quite, let's say, a good leader on this, because I mean there's some subsidies for ports. There's a good collaboration with all the regions that doing a great job as well to I'd say promote the development and the local, let's say, ecosystem as well needed, as we said earlier, for, I'd say, the floating wind market, which is quite not enough mature yet. That's normal because it's growing, it's new. But that's a key point as well. It's just to develop supply chain, and that's a key transition as well to collaboration, because between ports and UK, France, for instance, in Brest and others that can serve other markets in front of the channel that can benefit from all. And I think we need these synergies between countries just to promote this industry to launch basically the floating wind market.
Yeah, no, and I do fully agree with that. And I think in terms of floating offshore wind, what we see is a huge need in increased capacity. And you can talk about that in terms of transmission assets, whether that's HVAC or HVDC, very long lead time components. You can talk about that in terms of turbines. We need additional focus from turbine manufacturers to floating to allocate the resources needed to do the engineering to deliver these platforms. And we need the capacity, and whether that's dynamic cables or mooring systems, we need additional capacity in fabrication and manufacturing to deliver this. And I do believe that there is, across Europe, that there's a consortium and collaboration approach that matches very well here in terms of meeting European ambitions across floating industry. You see this at the shareholder level, and you also see this in major EPCIs, and I think also in developer level. But there is, and there remains, particularly in the UK, some challenges to that with grid connections and things that prevent some level of competition or cooperation, perhaps in the CFD. I think that's perhaps alleviated a little bit in the French market. But I do support the view that sort of collaboration in supply chain and increasing supply chain capacity is key. And yesterday we saw in Global Offshore Wind announcement for 400 million, I think, into the UK supply chain market. What we really need now is commitments. We need clarity in where that money was spent and which ports and which manufacturing facilities will be built. And I think that's, spades in the ground is where we then make the traction for the next phase.
You sound very consensual. I mean, you kind of seem to agree on everything. That was not the idea. No, but I'm very glad this is not a real fight. So I feel that this is SEANERGY 2025 is maybe the occasion to bury that century-long battle between France and the UK when it comes to offshore wind energy and converge towards a mixed model, right?
Agree, and I think we've discussed it before, but I think on the survey, I think it's a good thing. I don't know, maybe UK can converge on that. And I think on CFD, it needs, I say, security with indexation of, or we can take another CFD further down the road for the development phase. So I think that makes the good ingredients in the future. We've seen like the Dutch model, the Danish model as well, where they have even a step further, doing like the authorization, that gives even more, let's say, incentive for developers to be awarded, and then 1-2 years after take FID and do the job, basically execute and construct the project. So I think this is the way where I think it will converge in the coming years. I believe with the support, obviously, from all the parties and all the countries in Europe.
Yeah, and I also think we've had centuries of competitive rivalry, I think, between our great nations, and for me, it's perhaps about this collaboration and competition piece, or co-opetition, as I like to call it. But we of course want to work together where it's possible. We also want to spar off each other and help each other move forward in a competitive environment. So I think that bodes well for floating offshore wind. And for me, floating offshore wind brings both a great opportunity that perhaps was not taken with fixed bottom offshore wind in terms of supply chain. We see lots of opportunities now with increased sort of national investment in industry for that supply chain to develop more locally. And I think there's also a lot of opportunities in technology to integrate into floating offshore wind from the beginning. Whether that's monitoring systems or AI or smart data management, these kinds of things. They need to be built in as a base case from the beginning, I think. And whereas perhaps with fixed bottom offshore wind, we miss the boat on some of those.
Okay, great. So we agree that we're all friends, we love each other, we hug each other. We're still going to have a vote now, though, right? You're going to vote by putting up your hand. So obviously there are two choices, UK or France. So first, who says the country with croissants and café au lait came ahead out of this fight? Hands up. No hands? One vote. Who's in favor of Christmas pudding and tea? Okay. Congratulations.
It's a lot of abstentions.
A lot of abstentions. We need to work on that. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for the fight.
Thank
Thank you very much. Thank you.